Now, a word of warning at the outset. If you came this evening looking for an optimistic talk, one that would give you hope that the Western economic and political order isn't unraveling, well, I'm afraid you may be somewhat disappointed. Because Edward Luce, in his new book, The Retreat of Western Liberalism, makes a strong case that we ought to be worried. We ought to be concerned about some very disturbing trends undermining liberal democracy, of which Trump himself is only a reflection, a symptom, along with such other developments as Brexit and the strength of European populism. Now, remember back in the 1990s when the Berlin Wall came down and the Soviet Union collapsed? There was then a sense that liberal democracy was on an inevitable march across the rest of the globe. Well, not anymore. And Ed looks at why that is, what may be next, and what can be done to confront the crisis in the West that he depicts. As an experienced journalist with the Financial Times, where he's now chief U.S. columnist, Ed has been reporting on and commenting about American and international developments for some time. He took an initial stab at explaining America's relative decline in his previous book several years ago, Time to Start Thinking. In his new volume, he expands his analysis to the broader threat to liberal democracy, a threat with economic roots, it says, arguing that what held liberal democracies together most strongly was economic growth. When that growth falters, leaving some groups behind, faith in democracy erodes and illiberal tendencies exert themselves. What are the consequences of the decline of Western hegemony? A dominant China, widespread chaos. Ed considers the possibilities, and while he's not entirely entirely pessimistic, he does leave us with a persuasive admonition that we can't be complacent. We can't, for instance, just assume that in time Trump will pass and the United States will simply snap back to a pre-Trump mode. A review of Ed's book in the New York Times called it, quote, insightful and harrowing, and Publishers Weekly declared his historical analysis to be very much, quote, on point. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Edward Luce.
Thank you, Brad, for that that great and comprehensive introduction. I don't. Can you hear me now? All right. I was thanking Brad for that kind introduction, and just at the outset, reassuring you, you will not feel quite as suicidal as Brad might have indicated at the end of this talk as you do, as you might do now. So this is my third book, and my first two, my previous two. I also spoke at Politics and Prose. Now, I've done, for this particular book, which was launched 6-7 weeks ago, I've done 40 or 50 talks. But I don't feel a book is really launched until you've spoken at Politics and Prose. So thank you for coming, and thank you very much for having me, Brad. I really appreciate it. Now, Brad mentioned my last book, Time to Start Thinking, America and the Spectre of Decline. And a lot of people, this came out in 2012, a lot of people, I think quite understandably, accused me of being too pessimistic. The New York Times had an otherwise very generous review which said that my book shouldn't have been called Time to Start Thinking. It should be renamed Time to Start Drinking. And I understood why. I understood why there was this perspective. The book, of course, came out in a very, very different moment to the moment we're in now. It came out in mid-2012, when Barack Obama was on course to what looked like and turned out to be a relatively comfortable re-election, when America had been rebounding from the 2007-8 financial meltdown faster than other Western democracies, slowly by its own historic standards in terms of economic recovery, but faster than other Western countries, and where Barack Obama could quite plausibly project, as he later did, that a re-election, a second victory for him, would break the Republican fever. And that we would be able then to move on to perfectly rational things which most of us, I think, could probably agree on in this room, such as comprehensive immigration reform. So I understood why people accuse me of being too pessimistic, but the reason why I stuck to my guns and questioned other people's, what I called other people's irrational optimism, was because of the sort of basic indicators, ones which I deal with in this book, but which I dealt with in great detail in that last book. Namely that the middle was dropping out of politics. Now, it's not just because of the reasons that we're all familiar with, namely gerrymandering, the fact that lawmakers, that politicians select their voters. Voters don't choose their politicians. District boundaries are rigged. And not just because of the impact of technology in terms of polarizing who we listen to and what, and really obliterating the whole idea of a public square, which is essential to any functioning liberal democracy, not just because of these trends, but because of the economic trends, but because the middle was falling out of the middle class. And as the well-known late American scholar Barrington Moore said, no bourgeois, no democracy. You need a middle class to have a middle politics. And I think that remains as true today as when he wrote it. So that was why I stuck to my, I would say, skeptical guns rather than pessimistic, because as I hope to persuade you, I'm not quite as suicidally pessimistic as you might think from looking at the book. And the one indicator that expressed to me best what was going on in terms of the sort of caving in of the middle was not the economic statistics about rising inequality. It wasn't the fact that median wage stagnation, really was a fact of life and had been for most of the previous generation, barring the 1990s, or indeed the decline in income mobility. All of these things are important, but I think that the one single number that most stuck with me and still does is a self-definition number of Americans. When Americans are asked, as Gallup asks them periodically, annually, what class they belong to, and they give them a choice of lower class, middle class, and upper class. In the year 2000, 31% of Americans said they belonged to the lower class. By the year 2016, Trump's peak year, of course, and the last year Gallup asked that question, 49% of Americans answered that they were lower class. And that, to me, is a far more important predictor than economic statistics about how people are feeling. And so I think in this country, of all countries, and I'll broaden out to other democracies in a moment, but I think in America, of all countries, the country where the basic creed is equality of opportunity and self-reinvention and the spirit of being middle class, where to be American is to be middle class, that to me is a particularly troubling indicator. So let me sort of mention two or three very salient points about my book, about my latest book, and then briefly get on to where we are today. And I mean today, Trump, today, which is different to yesterday, and tomorrow it will be different, and I'll get on to that. So the first is the broader context, the retreat of liberalism worldwide, and the what Francis Fukuyama and other political scientists call the democratic recession, the global democratic recession. Now, as Brad mentioned, I start my book off in November 1989, where I was a student in Britain, and I heard, along with a group of other friends, that the Berlin Wall was falling, that Checkpoint Charlie had been opened up. and that grand symbol of the Cold War was now open, and you could go into East Berlin. And so we, that's me and a collection of friends, took a train to Dover, a ferry from Dover to Zeebrugge, and then we rented a car and we drove at high speed. In those days, the German Autobahn had no speed limit, and we exploited that and drove at high speed to Berlin and arrived there at the wall and participated in this glorious orgy of historic vandalism. And we borrowed pickaxes, and we got our own souvenirs, and we chipped away at this wall, and we brought back bits of the wall, and we returned a couple of days later back to England, slightly hungover, but really happy to have this historic piece of these historic souvenirs in our hands. And we were extremely optimistic then, as everybody with their eyes open was, about the future of liberal democracy. The Warsaw Pact had collapsed mostly without a shot being fired. Romania was, of course, a dramatic exception, but mostly to peaceful demonstrations. The quarrel between East and West was over. There was no longer, as Fukuyama said, really any argument about the end state of politics. And in his famous essay, which he wrote 3 months before November 1989 in The National Interest here in Washington, he made the point that there was no ideological competitor to liberal democratic capitalism. And we shared that view. And during the 1990s, that view was borne out. You saw democracy spread not just to Eastern and Central Europe, where indeed it very rapidly took hold, but also to Latin America, to Sub-Saharan Africa, Central Asia, and elsewhere. There was a global spread of democracy. So 10 years later, I had the great good fortune as a foreigner to be hired as a speechwriter to Larry Summers, who was then Bill Clinton's Treasury Secretary. And only in America moment, you hire a foreigner to do a job. And it was brilliant, and an extraordinary privilege, and a great insight into this, by now, what feels like a moment a long time ago, but the high noon, really, the late 1990s, of the unipolar world, of the world where there were no questions, really the most Fukuyama-ish moment you can think of, the late 90s. At that time, China was negotiating with the Clinton administration to join the World Trade Organization. As you'll recall, other tigers from Asia, principally from Asia, namely Thailand, South Korea, Indonesia, had fallen prey to what was generally called Asian flu, namely the sort of capital flows that flowed out when their ability to repay came into question. And they had followed what we all called the Washington Consensus, which was really an economic version of what Francis Fukuyama provided in political form, an economic toolkit to globalize, to move up the ladder, to become more like us. And that economic toolkit included many good things. I think free trade is a good thing. I think central bank monetary independence is a good thing from political interference. And some questionable things, such as open capital accounts, having free flow of money in and out when your currency is pegged to the dollar. And that last bit was what caused Asian flu. Now, China didn't follow the Washington Consensus. It ignored it. It was big enough not to have it imposed upon it. It was just too important to be pushed around, if you like. And so China, really, its rise and its accession to the WTO, in a funny way, marked the beginning of the end for the Washington Consensus. Now, jump another decade forward to 2008 and the Lehman Brothers collapse and the financial meltdown. Something that people in my profession call a global recession ensued from that. But we were quite wrong. It was an Atlantic recession, not a global recession. China and India kept growing. There was a little bit of a blip in 2009, but they kept growing at double-digit or near double-digit rates for the following years, and is still up at 6-7%. So what does this little sort of guide through my career in the last 30 years tell you? Well, that great dawn of democracy that we saw in 1990, 1991 has gone into, not reverse, but it has been checked and gone into something like a mild global recession since the year 2000. So there are now 25 fewer democracies around the world than there were 17 years ago. And that's a quite significant number of countries, particularly when you consider which countries they are. There is, of course, Russia. Now, when I was working for Larry Summers, Russia was basically considered to be a democracy, an imperfect, corrupt oligarchy, but basically one where there were noisy elections and freedom of speech. A year later, Putin was appointed prime minister by Yeltsin. Yeltsin dies, Putin takes over. It is no longer in any meaningful sense a democracy. Turkey is another good example. Again, not a minor example, a huge example. Turkey can no longer, I think, in any realistic way be described as a liberal democracy. I could throw out lots of other countries. Thailand had a military coup from which it's not really recovered. Botswana was the great sort of democratic hope of that part of Africa. That's no longer a democracy. Venezuela, you're familiar with. Poland, Hungary, the parts of the former Soviet bloc of the Warsaw Pact that were most enthusiastic about liberal democracy are now championing the phrase illiberal democracy, in the words of Viktor Orban, Hungary's president. And so what has been happening? Well, I mentioned the '08 recession. I mentioned medium wage stagnation. And of course, that recession hit us well into medium wage stagnation. We've had a middle class in the West that has been treading water or losing oxygen or going underwater, depending on which section of the middle class you look at, now for most of the time since the late 1970s. And then the '08 recession hits, and we recover slowly, we limp out of it, at a time when China, India, and others are growing at, as I say, near double-digit rates. And this has a huge impact on the attractiveness of democracy as a model for the rest of the world. Remember, over this period, and I'm talking the last 8 years, China has been spending enormous amounts of money on its soft power. It's been extending loans, building infrastructure, giving unconditional grants to developing countries all over the world. Of course, to feed its very hungry, insatiable commodity machine. But nevertheless, these are on terms that are more generous and more quickly negotiated than the World Bank and the IMF and other Bretton Woods institutions are offering. That's one thing. Another, of course, is that China is spending on cultural soft power. So Confucius, there's barely a week goes by where a Confucius Institute is not opened up, or where Xinhua or CCTV, the Chinese state arms of the media, do not open another bureau somewhere in the world. There's an expansion to China's presence and its projection of its power, soft power, that has been quite marked in the last 7 or 8 years. And this coincides with a time where our media, broadcast and print, are just shutting down their foreign bureaus. We can't afford it anymore. I'm not talking about the FT. The Financial Times maintains all its bureaus. But generally speaking, there's been an extraordinary secular decline in our coverage of the rest of the world and our presence in the rest of the world. And the same applies to the resources China has put into diplomacy. So we're in a situation now where Chinese diplomacy is no longer quite the crude Hu Jintao reading out talking points to people. Xi Jinping is a more sophisticated, a more fluent operator, and Chinese diplomacy reflects that. So I have no doubt that China is a less attractive model than any Western liberal democracy. I have absolutely no doubt that it is incapable of replacing the United States as the world's leading hegemon. I have no doubt on either of those points, but we are cutting back and they are expanding, and that has an impact on the relative price of political systems. Authoritarian models of development look quite glamorous nowadays. It should also be mentioned that Donald Trump's budget proposes to cut the State Department by 30%, an extraordinary act at a time like this. The only silver lining of which is that it's unlikely to be enacted by Congress. So that's one point. The second, and I'll get to the second and the third, I'll keep an eye on the time. I've recently been told that I talk way longer than I say I'm going to, so I'm going to keep an eye on the time. The second point I wanted to make about this book is what's happening here in the West, the rise of populism across the Western world. Now, populism, is a bit like Tolstoy's Unhappy Families. It's unique in each situation, and people are quite right to point out that it's worse in some countries than in others. And we here in the United States and in the country of my birth, Britain, have been having it worse and experiencing it worse than in much of continental Europe. And so therefore, is this an Anglo-Saxon problem rather than a Western democracy problem? And I think the answer is yes and no. I'd say no, because there are other parts of the continent, if we skip over for a moment France and Germany, where populism is an extremely virulent condition and is either in power or on the cusp of power or sharing power. I was in Austria for a few days late last year, just before it held its presidential election, in which the far-right, I won't say neo-Nazi, I will say the far-right candidate, Norbert Hofer, lost the election by a margin of 53 to 47, so he lost it narrowly. And a lot of people said, there we are, the populist wave has broken. We had Brexit, we had Trump, but now the Austrians have shown they're not going to win. A postmodern neo-Nazi got 47% of the vote. And I think this is way too low a bar to measure the health of liberal democracy. I've mentioned Hungary, and I've mentioned Poland, which are in a questionable condition. But let me move on to a positive example, France. That's been, I think, the French presidential election and the French parliamentary elections, by far the most positive event in 2017. And if you look at France, the glass of champagne is very definitely half full, not half empty. Macron, as you know, vanquished Marine Le Pen and the National Front, and he did so more comprehensively than we had feared. And the same happened in the legislative elections in June. His party, En Marche, which was only set up 15 months ago, won a majority of the seats. So France, the glass is definitely half full. I would have some big question marks about whether Macron can carry out what he wants to carry out. He does have what you might describe as a Thatcherite program of labor reform, much of which I think is necessary. The 35-hour week and other restrictions on French workplaces need to be reformed. But remember that he was elected with historic low turnout, the lowest in French presidential votes by far. And the same applies to the legislative elections. Very thin, broad support, but very thin. And France has a tradition of anti-politics politics, where you protest from the outside and paralyze it. So Macron must succeed, and it is an incredibly better outcome than the alternatives. But it's too early to drink the rest of the bottle of champagne. The one really, I think, undiluted positive example of a country that is fending off populism is Germany. Now, Germany, Angela Merkel, Germany's chancellor, is due to probably, if you believe the polls, which of course is a very, very big thing to do nowadays, they're often wrong. But if you believe the polls, which have been consistent for months, on course for a fourth consecutive re-election victory, election in September. Now, nowhere else in the Western world is the establishment getting re-elected again and again and again. And I think it is worth asking why Germany has got stronger antibodies against populism than other Western democracies. And one such reason, of course, is its civic education system stemming from its history. And that, I think, differentiates Germany from Austria. Austria presents itself in its school books and in its history essentially as a victim of Nazism, quite inaccurately. Germany totally owns its responsibility, and I think that's a very important piece. But I think there is another really important piece here, which is that Germany has a middle class that is relatively happy. During the 2008 recession, German employers and unions and local governments in the land negotiated deals whereby the companies would not lay people off. They wouldn't fire people. They would just reduce everybody's hours, but they would keep them on their books. And of course, such a mentality is very, very unfamiliar to us in the English-speaking world, because if you keep people on your books, they're loyal to you, and you're loyal to them. You want to invest in their skills and in their training because they're going to stick around. And so it's a quite different relationship, which I think is part of the explanation for why the German middle class is less vulnerable to populism than ours. And I think another is that it does have, I think, a more pragmatic system of vocational education, that not everybody is a one-size-fits-all destined for four-year college degrees. That the Germans, I think, don't make the mistake that we make, which is to confuse having a college degree with being skilled. And I say this with personal experience. Yeah. And likewise, not to confuse not having a college degree with being unskilled. And I think that's an important distinction. But there is a final point here, and then I'm going to get on to Trump very briefly. There is a final point here about Germany, which is when I make this point to Germans or write about it, because I think it's a very, very important point, Germans are the first to find holes in my argument. They're the first to criticize me for being far too upbeat, for being far too happy about the German situation, and the first to tell me that they're worried about the sustainability of their system because of competition from Central Europe and elsewhere. And I think that is also a strength. And I think in the English-speaking world, we have, since 91, but beyond, been used to just always being right, always being the countries that others should emulate, and therefore become quite complacent and quite triumphalist. And I think that is a weakness that we're now beginning to see the effects of. My final point is about Trump. And I couldn't really have a talk about the retreat of Western liberalism without talking about Trump. I should mention that my book is called The Retreat of Western Liberalism, and there was some suggestion from my publisher that it be called The Collapse of Western Liberalism. And I think that's because we were all watching Trump happen. But I successfully argued, no, it's not a collapse. It's a retreat. And a retreat implies the possibility of regrouping. And I believe that possibility is very live. 2 points about Trump, and then I'll get into any questions you might have. The first is that he very skillfully picked up on all the trends I've been talking about and appealed to the forgotten American man and woman, and was very good at playing and bringing out those simmering class resentments, which, because you're Americans, you don't like to admit. But there is a very, very entrenched class system in the United States, and that's fairly recent, I think. And he was very, very skillful at exploiting that. Now, of course, he also switched the dog whistle on race and on women for a megaphone. And that played a huge, huge role in his election and in his sort of iconoclastic ability to say, I am against political correctness. There was something that appealed to many Americans as being refreshing about that. I don't know why, but that was certainly a part of his success. But I think for the purposes of the point I want to make, which is the forgotten American aspect of his campaign, what's been extraordinary about the last 6 months, and I think is going to remain true through the Trump administration for however long it lasts, is the degree to which Trump is essentially carrying out a bait and switch in terms of his economic agenda. Now, you remember he did differentiate himself from other Republican candidates by saying, I will protect entitlements. And I love the poorly educated and all these kinds of phrases that suggested, and of course a big infrastructure program was promised, which suggested he was a different kind of economically more pragmatic Republican, less Paul Ryan, more Dwight Eisenhower in terms of the economic piece of his program. And as we've seen, no such plans are in the pipeline. He is essentially pursuing policies, as you see in his budget proposal, which he came out with a couple of months ago, that would drastically cut support for the middle class, that would drastically reduce budgets for worker training, for all the kinds of things we know America needs and most Western democracies need, what I call a Marshall Plan for the middle class, that he's going exactly full speed in the opposite direction. And the only silver lining, as I say, is that he's too incompetent to carry this out. But that's the direction he's going in. And even if he doesn't carry it out, we're going to see a situation where the conditions that led to his election will be drastically exacerbated by the time we get to the next election. Where that leads, I don't know. But what I will say, and I'll close on this point, is that we're today, as I say, here in Washington on July 26th, in the midst of what I think could be the beginnings of a constitutional crisis. Now, many of you will remember the Watergate crisis, and you will remember the Saturday Night Massacre, where Nixon asked Elliot Richardson, his Attorney General, to fire Archibald Cox, his special prosecutor, the investigator looking into Nixon's crimes. And Richardson refused and resigned. So then Nixon turns to his deputy, William Ruckelshaus, and asks him the same thing. Will you fire the special counsel? And Ruckelshaus says no, and he resigns. And finally Nixon gets to Robert Bork, a name who became more famous later on. And Robert Bork, third in the chain of command, he agrees to fire Archibald Cox. It didn't have any impact on the final outcome. The tapes were out, and Nixon couldn't stop the tapes from getting out. A couple of people aren't remembered from those days. One of whom is called Randolph Thrower, and the other's called Billy Walters. Now, Thrower was head of the IRS, and Nixon went to him and he said, here's my enemies list. I want you to audit them. And it included a lot of Democrats, included honest Republicans, some judges, and he refused, so Nixon fired him. And then he said to his staff, get me somebody more cooperative into the IRS. So that he got this guy, Johnny Walters, William Walters, but Johnny Walters as he was known. And Walters was asked to do the same thing. And he refused to do it, but he refused to do less directly. What he did was he gave the enemies list to George Shultz, the Secretary of the Treasury, who then said, okay, look, just lock it away in a safe. And then later on in the Watergate saga, he handed it over to Congress. So the reason I mention that is because there are, of course, extraordinary parallels. I don't think it takes a great genius to read what Trump is doing right now. He's easier to read than a traffic light. Trump wants to get rid of Sessions. because Sessions cannot fire Mueller. Sessions, as you know, has recused himself. But he can't then go down to Rod Rosenstein, the Deputy Attorney General, because Rod Rosenstein was the guy who appointed Mueller, having fired Jim Comey at Trump's request, again, for, I think, the intent to obstruct justice. What will happen? I don't know. But I do think we're at the early stages of a constitutional crisis. And the reason I mentioned that bit of Nixon history, with which pretty much all of you, I'm sure, are familiar, is because we live in a system of laws, not of men. That's what the great founding fathers of this country set up. And it was an extraordinary and remains an extraordinary system. But as they knew, and as subsequent generations find out for themselves, systems don't uphold themselves. It depends on the people who work within them. People like Randolph Thrower, people like Elliot Richardson, people who refused to do the bidding of an executive power that is unchecked and venal. And so we are here, as I say, in Washington on July the 26th, 2017, at the early stages of what I think could be a constitutional crisis. And somebody, somewhere, or hopefully more than one person, within a few miles of where we are, is going to answer this question whether this is a retreat or not, with their actions, through their moral character. That's ultimately what this boils down to. So Brad very, very kindly summarized my book, and accurately, as saying, look, this is about economic growth. I do think liberal democracy is successful because it has delivered the goods. But I also think it's successful because people understand and have understood at critical junctures in history what it takes to sustain a liberal democracy. And I believe that we're going to find that out in the coming months in Washington. And I think we'll get to the right answer. I certainly hope so. So I hope you're a bit less suicidal than at the beginning. Thank you very much for your time, and I'll be delighted to take questions. How are you? And I've been asked for anybody who, to use the mic.
Thank you very much for that presentation. I'd like to come back to your almost parenthetical call for a Marshall Plan for the middle class. Perhaps you discuss this in some detail in the book. Consider, if you would please, that unlike Germany, where there's at least post-World War tradition of government, business, banks, unions working together. In this country, we lack that. And indeed, I would argue we have an antagonistic relationship between government and business. Do you think that that's a significant factor in relation to the prospects for a Marshall Plan for the middle class? And do you have any thoughts about how we get beyond that?
So the great strength of the American system, one it shares with Germany in a different way, is federalism. That the fact that it's stuck here in Washington, which it is, and which it is likely to remain, or which we now hope it will remain for the duration of Trump. The fact that it's stuck isn't the end of the story, as it would be in Britain. That what happens in states and cities and in municipalities and localities can have a huge impact. And so I think you're right. At the national level, employer-employee cooperation, these sort of grand compacts that they have in Germany, are very unlikely. But I think at the local level, where people take ownership for what they do, far more than they ever do here, there are far better prospects. That said, America does need a federal Marshall Plan for the middle classes, and I don't just mean taxpayers' money. I mean bailing in private money into this. It's in everybody's interests that we equip our workforces for the future of work. It's an absolute ground zero of the situation we're in, and we're not even debating it, let alone doing it. So it does have to happen at the federal level as well. Oh, sorry.
Can I read you a few stats, and I'd like to ask you a question?
Sure.
67% of Londoners voted to stay in the EU. 493 wealthiest counties in the United States voted for Hillary. And if one assumes that wealth is a proxy for intelligence, then 493 most intelligent counties voted for Hillary. More than 50% of the Moscow vote was against Putin. And there's one, oh yeah, and for the first time in 2016, most Republican voters had no college degree. So you talk about this idea of sort of a civics test that one would have to pass to get the right to vote. I got the right to vote when I was 18 because of a chronological, happening. What is your view on having some kind of civics test or government test or some threshold that somebody in the United States would have to demonstrate in order to vote?
Thank you. It's a good question. For those who didn't hear through the mic, he was asking whether there should be a civics test, a basic minimum knowledge, competence before you vote. It's a good question because it's been debated. I wholeheartedly, viscerally reject the idea. But it is worth noting that, this depending on where you are and what the election result was, this debate takes place in different forms. So after Brexit, a lot of people were half seriously and some very seriously debating whether old people should be deprived of the right to vote because they would never live with the consequences of the way they voted. Like it's sort of an eye test for whether you can continue driving. And I think that should demonstrate my point as to why. Who is it that what should be the criteria? It's like once you go down that path, democracy's over. It's just once one exception is made, the whole house of cards comes crumbling down. So it's a really good question, though, because it makes you think, what is it that we're defending here? And it isn't expertise, although I feel very, very strongly we should listen to experts on global warming and God knows what else. But it isn't actually about expertise. It's not about plebiscites either, at the other end of the spectrum. We're not asking for a rule of experts, and we're not arguing for instant democracy. We know full well that the complex questions we face that involve science, cross-border, jurisdictions, all kinds of trade-offs and nuances cannot be decided by referendums. It's about representative democracy. This is still the answer. We've just got to find a way of rejuvenating it and reimagining it. And I think everybody should be voting in it when we do. But thank you for the question. It was a good one.
Hi, thanks very much for a great talk. I'm afraid my question has more to do with the early part of your talk, that is China, than it does with the kind of the culmination of the arguments you made, which I found really compelling, and probably most people did more than a question about China. But it's been in the news recently that China plans to spend $1 trillion on infrastructure that'll help their the growth, really, of their economy, especially their trade and so forth. And more generally, you mentioned that a lot of people have said that the health of the middle class and the health of the bourgeoisie and the health of that sort of growth of the economy is essential to Western liberalism. So the question is, do you think there is hope for China in the future that would have to do with this growth of their economy and with the health of a growing middle class?
So it's a good question. I'm not particularly qualified to answer, a projection about China's economic trends. I do know that those who are more qualified or less unqualified than me to answer that question believe in the short term that China rather does have a severe domestic debt problem, and that they're choosing to let the air out of the balloon very slowly by having slower growth. But some believe you should just reconcile the debts, take a couple of years recession and move on. And so there is a debate about whether China is growing old before it gets rich. And if you look at its demography, there are huge problems that China faces. And it's in our interests that they deal with and overcome those problems. I really do not seriously think that China believes that it can replace the US as the world leader. And if it did believe that, it would be delusional. My fear is not that China is going to replace America, it's that chaos will replace America, where nobody... America has allies. Its power is magnified by alliances. China doesn't have one single ally. Not one. Not one formal treaty alliance. America has dozens and bases everywhere. And it's a magnification of American power, and it has soft power. Until recently, it believed in immigration. It has a universal model. None of this describes China. It is in our interest that China succeeds, though, because it's essentially, the largest source of demand. It's one of the engines of a twin-engined global economy. But I'm not qualified to answer whether it's the degree to which it will succeed.
Thanks a lot.
Hi.
Hi, Ed. I
are
don't
you?
know if you remember this, but my friend and I had the great pleasure of meeting you at a Brookings event last year, and we ended up in DuPont Circle in about an hours-long conversation, which is what I love about Washington. And thank you for Politics and Prose, too. You made some interesting comments about how liberalism, or liberal democracy, delivered the goods, and that's why we ended up with a solid middle class. And I would argue that over the last 40 years, the established liberal democracy has failed in delivering. And I think what we're in now is less of an economics situation than a simple physics explanation. And that is, if you squeeze a balloon too long and too hard at one end, it explodes at the other. You've squeezed people, the establishment has squeezed people too long and too hard, and all of a sudden they popped. They would have voted for Donald Duck, in this election versus an established politician, because they just haven't been able to deliver. How do we bring integrity back into this political process? How do we get the political parties to no longer look to special interests as their audience, but to us, the very middle class that they proclaim that they want to help? And is there a way that we can walk back all this incivility and all this craziness that we're involved with now? Thank you.
A very good question again. So I could give you a sort of long disquisition on that. I'm going to keep my answer short. And I'm going to just focus on one thing of how we change the nature of our politics here. And that is gerrymandering. The reason why it's not, I talk to many legislators in both parties. The problem is a particularly bad one with the Republican Party, I think it's fair to say. And they'd love to vote for certain things they don't vote for. And the reason they don't vote for them, such as keeping the good aspects of Obamacare, or an infrastructure bill, or a Marshall Plan for the middle classes. I mean, these people are not out of touch with those in their constituencies. The problem is they're too in touch with their party base, because the only real threat to their job comes in a primary. That's the threat. And so the piece of hope I've got is the Supreme Court has agreed to hear a case that challenges the political committees that draw district boundaries. And if the Supreme Court basically declares them unconstitutional, extends the Voting Rights Act to include not just racial discrimination, but to include political bias, then that could be the beginnings of quite a big change. But I don't think it'll be big enough, because senators are just as polarized as congressmen, and they don't draw their boundaries. State boundaries are. There is something deeper there that's causing polarization, and if I had the cure, I would tell you. Thank you. Please.
Yes, hi. I just a point of clarification, because I may have gotten this wrong, but it seemed somewhere in the middle you were equating liberal democracy strength with capitalism, and then went on to say that Germany is a good example of a country as a bulwark against this kind of populist front, and you mentioned that's partially because of, or Macron, sorry, that's partially because of potentially Thatcherite policies, industrial policies, which you sort of seem to applaud. So the question I have is, in this country there was another populist candidate that ran, that did very well and came very close out of nowhere, and that populist candidate based his campaign on wanting to ape what I would call the soft socialist countries, which we've ignored, of Northern Europe, Canada, and it was making the case that indeed unbridled capitalism was part of the problem. Could you just sort of clarify where you are in that kind of matrix of and respond to the Bernie Sanders phenomenon in this country?
There are many attractive things about Bernie Sanders' program, which he's still continuing with. One of which I believe is single payer healthcare. I think it's an absolute minimum, not just on economic grounds, but where it's a very, very efficient system of delivering healthcare, but also on civilizational grounds, that our society's moral worth is defined by how we treat people in terms of their health. And that to me is a basic minimum. So I agree with his moral absolutism, if you like, on that question. I see him very much as the Danish candidate, in American politics. I did listen to him and went to a few rallies, and I ultimately you've got to have some way of paying for the things you're promising. And there were a lot of free goodies, but there was no credible economic thinking behind it. And so, I share some of Sanders' views of the world. I share his view about the corroding influence of money in politics. But I'm not sure that even Denmark would recognize Sanders' program as a whole. Denmark is pretty fiscally responsible. It generates revenues to pay for its programs. And I think one of the most impressive things about the Scandinavians, I focused on Germany, but is their training programs for the middle class. And that's something Sanders wanted, that's something Hillary wanted. Trump pretended to want it. Most people, in politics, off the record, will say they totally agree this is an essential thing to do. It's not just Sanders, but it's not happening. So that's not really a very good answer to your question.
Well, it's tax. Denmark.
Would I vote for Sanders?
I know other people want to talk. Just one, but that is partially what Sanders was getting at, that he couldn't touch, which is the third rail of liberal or left politics in the United States, is that there's got to be a concomitant tax policy to support these things. If you were in Canada or if you were in Denmark, Denmark's very fiscally responsible, but that's because their citizens pay a tax rate that would make most people in this country clutch their chests and fall to the ground. So
that's true. That's very true. And maybe it's more than the traffic will bear, but you have to make the argument. I would agree, we need a more fiscally progressive system. America spends $1 trillion a year on tax expenditure, and which is mostly tax subsidies to people with 529s, to people with large mortgage interest bills, to people who are already wealthy. We're squandering money here on the wrong targets, and that's a part of it. It's not just the tax rate; it's what we do with tax subsidies. Mm-hmm. So I would agree with that, but you need to generate wealth as well.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
To Truman. So I'd like to take you back to 50,000 feet, right? So you said the retreat of Western liberalism, but I'm not sure it's clear to me anyhow what you really mean by Western liberalism, right? And so maybe you could help the audience by saying, how are you? So what is it as in your world, and therefore what are we retreating from?
That's a good question. So by liberalism, I do not mean it in the American partisan definition. I don't mean liberals in this context. I mean it in the classical Western context. The context also meant by Alexander Hamilton and James Madison and the Great Enlightenment thought, which is that the institutions that are a core part of democratic societies actually in many ways precede them and in many ways more important than them. Independence of the judiciary, freedom of press, the separation of powers, and so forth. All of these are aspects of a republic, a modern republic, which is what the Founding Fathers set up, and indeed aspects of what European democracies created long before they had anything anywhere near a full franchise, democratic electoral franchise. And so that's what I mean by liberalism. And, people talk about illiberal democracy. The Hungarians talk about it. The Poles do. Fareed Zakaria first talked about it like 15 years ago. And the idea I think we have in our head, a very popular common sense idea of democracy, is it's just we vote every few years. But that would be the tyranny of the majority. That's something that isn't really what I'm talking about when I refer to liberalism. I refer to the protections against simple demagogic politics, and we need both. We do need free and fair elections, but we also need the institutions to act as a check on who we elect.
Thank you. Congratulations.
Thank you. Oh, sorry, Ted, right? Oh, I'm sorry, Ted. I recognize you now. It was Bull before. In a very nice way. Sorry, I didn't mean that. Hi.
Thank you, first of all, for the gentleman who asked the question, because mine is sort of going to serve as a follow-up. I'm Baran Kayolu. I teach world history at the American University of Iraq Soleimani. Thoroughly enjoyed this book, by the way, folks. Everyone should read it. Please do buy it. My question, both reading the book and listening to you a moment ago, when talking about Nixon, the Nixon years and the Ford years and then Carter coincided with very similar concerns that we have right now. A retreat of Western liberalism. It looked like the Soviet Union, the communist model was on the march around the world, and the West was in retreat. Mm-hmm. And then came the 80s and 90s. So my question is, what would be your prescription? You specifically try to avoid writing prescriptions at the end of the book in the last chapter. But I was wondering if I can take you in that direction and tell us how, after this retreat, the West could regroup and then maybe bring some of its old allies back into its fold. I'm also asking this because I'm Turkish, and these issues are extremely close to my heart. So thank you for bringing up Russia and Turkey.
Thank you. So, but specifically, just so I understand your question, you want prescriptions?
Or
no.
Take it in any way you want. If you want a couple of 3, 4. You mentioned universal basic income here, for example. What else would you suggest for the West to regroup after the retreat?
So one of the reasons I don't get too deeply into prescriptions, I mean, I have some that are generally sketched out, is because I know that if you start getting into long laundry lists, you become a piñata. And suddenly people find a reason. They end the book with it. That's what they remember. And the purpose of this book is to actually make people worried, so that they understand. The more worried we are, the more we understand what's going wrong, the less worried I am. I think that's a sort of essential step to correcting how we're managing our democracies and how we're behaving within them. And so that's why I sort of avoided too many prescriptions. You mentioned universal basic income. I can see the sort of superficially attractive merit of UBI. And for those who don't know, I'm sure most of you do, it's essentially a basic citizen's income everybody gets paid. So say $15,000 a year, and then you get nothing else. No housing assistance, no tax breaks if you're rich. You basically all, regardless of income, get, say, $15,000 a year. And I can see the relative attraction of that, it's simple, it's a right, everybody has it, it's therefore safe. And bureaucrats don't decide who's eligible and who isn't eligible for assistance. But I think there are a couple of problems. First is it would be demolished in politics. It's money for nothing. This would be so easy to destroy in a campaign and so difficult to defend, so I don't believe it would pass. But second, I think it's a really inefficient use of resources to give, every millionaire and billionaire $15,000 a year. And finally, I think, and I'm not giving you prescriptions here, I'm giving you more diagnoses, I apologize. But finally, I think people want to work. People actually want to feel they're useful and they want to feel they're wanted. And if you look at the unemployment numbers, after 6 months, people's morale starts collapsing. I mean, we've had a decline in life expectancy in America for whole sections of this country, which is unheard of outside of war. It's not because of a loss of income. I mean, that's part of it. It's a loss of morale. There's a loss of status. And large sections of this country, which is a sort of milder version of what you saw in Russia in the 1990s after the collapse of the Soviet Union. So I want the elites, I want people who read books like this to understand the point that the gentleman, I think, was partly referring to with his Sanders point, is we need to remember we're all in this together. and that protecting our tax breaks and protecting a fiscal system that is, and this is where I agree with Sanders, rigged by and large for the top 20%. That's not actually protection or safety in the long run. It's an extremely dangerous path to continue down. So that's really the main point of this book, is we have to rethink these things. I can give you a laundry list later if you like. I don't. Sorry, this side. Yeah.
Technically, we're out of time, but it looks like we maybe have 4 more questions.
Four more questions.
For like about 30 seconds.
Sorry, I'll answer quickly if you ask
Yeah,
them
it's quick.
quickly.
So, using your champagne analogy that you used earlier with Germany and France, I was just wondering how much champagne we should put into the Canadian champagne flute with Prime Minister Trudeau.
I think we should get drunk in Canada. It's good there at the moment. I saw that the Canadian Armed Forces today, interesting timing, put out a very good tweet saying people of all sexual orientations and genders are welcome to join the Canadian Armed Forces. Yeah, so
How are you?
good.
One hears endless conversations and reads endlessly about democracy in Washington more than any other place I've been. But getting people to recognize how important connecting the economics to the democracy conversation is a much more difficult conversation in these exalted settings. And you've touched on it, and the questions have too, but we're in a country, and you probably know the statistics better than I, where 69% of the people can't come up with $1,000. We've had that struggle for the fight for 15. We see this thing circulating in social media that says the Burger King worker in Denmark comes up again, gets $20 an hour, they get 12 here. With the departure of the manufacturing sector in this country and its replacement with service jobs, you know, people love work, but they like meaningful work, not mindless work. We have huge challenges facing the workforce, you know, with robotics and technology coming our way, a need to educate them, and a need to raise the wages across the board so as we can have higher expectations for our children and grandchildren as they come along in society. Those have fallen off. That's part of the reason there was such popularity for Sanders among young people, and part of the, I'll call it despair, that drove people to buy our current president's demagoguery. So my question is, how important do you think connecting economics and good pay to these lower paying jobs is important to the sustenance and the revival of democracy?
I mean, middle class incomes are very important. I mean, you could theoretically raise the minimum wage to $20 an hour, but people would then lose jobs. You'd then accelerate the automation because the capital substitution for labor would be that much more attractive to employers. So I'm not sure minimum wage is the answer. It should be higher than it is, the federal one in particular, but I'm not sure that's really the answer. I'll just give you one very, very quick statistic. There are 84,000 steel workers in America, and there are 77,000 coal workers. Sorry, the other way around. 84,000 coal miners and 77,000 steel. And Trump wants to go back to the days when there were many, many more. Now, quite why you'd want, you know, more people to go down the mines and get black lung disease, I have no idea. But anyway, that's his aim is a nostalgic economics. There are 15.5 million people working in retail in America, 100,000 of whom have lost their jobs since Trump was elected. Not a word about them. Not a word about the future. So whatever the answer is, it cannot be nostalgia. It has to be looking at what's in front of us and what's likely to come. Yeah. Two more, final two. Sorry.
At the end of your talk, you offered quite an optimistic note about America, but as a fellow Brit, I still feel a bit suicidal and pessimistic.
You do anyway. You know,
yeah, well, that's true. But I really believe that Brexit is worse than Trump, and I think that the political system in the UK, in the way that Labour and the Tories have really sort of abandoned liberal ideas, I feel that the situation is probably worse than in America. So I was wondering if you could offer any hope for
Britain.
liberal ideas of Britain. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, the reason why you're feeling bleaker about Britain than America is, I guess, that, Trump can be can lose in 4 years, 3.5 years, or be removed, whereas Brexit is for keeps. I don't know, the situation's fluid enough that I'm no longer ruling out the fantasy of a second referendum. And I don't think it's a fantasy. I don't think it's a probability, but maybe it's a 1 in 5 chance now. And I think that if the British people were given a second bite at this apple, like the Irish were, like the French were for different referendums, they would think about it a bit more carefully this time. I think the day after Brexit, there was apocryphal, everybody Googled what is the EU.
Yeah.
I don't think that was I think that was a fake story. But the great sort of saving grace of the recent general election, which produced a bit of a mess, is that young people turned out huge numbers compared to the Brexit referendum. And that's a very, very encouraging trend. I'll just sort of finish with this, which is Theresa May. Trump is incompetent, but Theresa May is a competitor. And I'm beginning to... I'm beginning to think she's the worst prime minister since David Cameron, probably. Please.
Thank you for a fascinating talk. It confirmed most of my prejudices, and I'm German, so your talk, I think, was fascinating and brilliant. My question is on the last part of your talk referring to potential constitutional crisis. And if I understood you right, you were suggesting that the future of America will depend on a few good people being in the right place at the right time. Now, I want to tickle a little bit your imagination. What if these people are not there where they ought to be when the hour comes?
So far, I'm quite confident that the judicial system has by and large been doing its job. The Ninth Circuit, other circuits, Seventh, I believe. The independence of the separation of powers is working insofar as judiciary is concerned. Congress is a different matter. We're going to have to look and see if there's a Howard Baker or a Sam Ervin, Republicans who stood up to Nixon. And I just don't know the answer to that question. I know that we probably all share the same hope that it's the right answer. I believe there's enough depth of outrage in America. People are awoke, as millennials say, that there's a pretty good bet that there are enough good people out there to stop this monstrous presidency. Sorry, and if there are any Trumpians here, I apologize. Thank you so much for your time.